On March 22, 1933, the first concentration camp in Nazi Germany was opened in Dachau. It was the place where the system of punishments and various forms of physical and psychological abuse of prisoners began to be experienced for the first time. During this period, Dachau became an experimental training ground where the Nazis practiced methods of suppressing political opponents of the Nazi regime. Among the first prisoners were communists, socialists, and clergymen who dared to speak out against fascism. Any attempts to conduct medical experiments on humans, especially without their consent, are met with worldwide condemnation. Today, such actions are severely punished as they contradict moral and legal norms, even if the experiments do not pose an immediate danger. When the Allied forces launched their offensive, the Nazis moved prisoners deep into Germany en masse. Thousands of people died on the way, and those who could not walk were shot on the spot. The trial of German doctors has revealed the terrible facts about thousands of tortured prisoners of Nazi concentration camps. The idea of creating a super soldier originated with the Führer even before the outbreak of World War II. The Dachau concentration camp was created in order to conduct experiments, including with people. The camp on an area of more than 230 hectares was surrounded by a high wall, hiding from the world the horrors that were happening inside. Not only Russians died in this hell, but also Ukrainians, Austrians, Germans, as well as other prisoners of war and political prisoners. Dachau concentration camp, located near Munich, was one of the first Nazi camps opened after the Führer came to power in 1933. It was originally intended to fight the opponents of the Third Reich, primarily to eliminate those who were considered dangerous elements or genetic impurities. By this term, the fascists meant Jews, communists, socialists, as well as people with antisocial behavior. Prostitutes, homosexuals, drug addicts, alcoholics, vagrants, mentally ill people, and clergy who resist the authorities. There is a tragic legend in a Bavarian town that the concentration camp was built in response to the resistance of local residents to the Führer in the elections. According to this myth, the pipes of the crematorium were installed in such a way that the smoke from the incinerated penetrated into the city streets, ostensibly to punish the residents. The camp was huge with 34 barracks, and it housed advanced equipment for conducting experiments on humans, in which certified doctors participated. These medical experiments were conducted under the guise of the needs of science and medicine, although in fact they were part of the Nazi extermination program. As a result of the 250,000 prisoners in the camp, few survived, about 70,000 young and healthy people. There was a system of distinctions between prisoners in the camp. Red triangles were sewn onto the clothes of political prisoners, yellow triangles for Jews, pink triangles for homosexuals, and green triangles for criminals. Soviet prisoners of war were often used as targets for new recruits, teaching them how to shoot, sometimes leaving them right at the firing range or sending them alive to the crematorium. Medical experiments allowed medical students to train on living people, turning them into teaching aids. Healthy prisoners were often tortured and severely punished, and their will was suppressed to prevent uprisings and protests. Prisoners of the Dachau camp faced daily torture, starvation, and overcrowded barracks. Life in the camp was terrible, and a special place among the sufferings of the prisoners was occupied by medical experiments that were conducted to find out the limits of the human body and create soldiers with superpowers. One of these prisoners was Anatoly Soy, who ended up in the camp at a young age. The Führer was personally interested in research on the creation of an invincible army and finding out the capabilities of the human body. The prisoners were chosen to be exceptionally healthy between the ages of 20 and 45, but adolescents such as Anatoly, aged 14 to 16, were also used for experiments. These young people served as objects of research, the purpose of which was to find out the possibility of regulating human growth and other physical parameters. However, Anatoly fell ill with a rare disease and was transferred to an experimental unit where infected people with tropical infections were kept. Only the amazing strength of his body allowed him to survive until the moment when antibiotics were applied, and experiments on him allowed him to further test effective treatment. In addition, the camp had a box for monitoring the development of tuberculosis in which there were seriously ill people who were specially infected with this disease. Doctors deliberately allowed diseases to develop in order to find treatments that could be effective in extreme conditions. According to the investigation materials, not only experiments with new medicines and treatment methods were conducted outside the camp, but also research aimed at finding out how various environmental factors affect the human body. For example, throughout the Second World War, Dr. Schilling conducted experiments infecting prisoners with malaria. Some of the subjects died from the disease itself, many from unsuccessful methods and means of treatment. Sigismund Roscher placed the unfortunate in a pressure chamber with different pressures and changing loads, simulated extreme conditions. Signs with the words "shower room" were installed on the doors to the gas chambers, so the prisoners understood what was happening to them only during the experiment itself. In special chambers, the effects of toxic gases and other toxic agents were tested. The research, as a rule, ended with an autopsy and recording of the results. The remains of the unfortunate were sent to institutes and laboratories for research. Goering expressed gratitude to Himmler for such experiments and the results obtained in the course of Roscher's work. Among Roscher's infamous works, experiments on the effects of extreme cold on the human body stand out. The subjects were exposed to prolonged exposure to low temperatures, including hours in the cold and doused with ice water. In the course of the research, situations with immersion of people in cold water were simulated, in which the body temperature dropped to a critical 28 degrees. Saving on painkillers, the researcher practically did not use anesthesia. Due to the fact that the screams of the subjects could attract unwanted attention, Roscher petitioned to move the research to a more isolated place, in particular suggesting Auschwitz. Painkillers were used extremely rarely and only in cases where there was a risk of a breach of secrecy due to the screams of the victims. At the end of 1942, a closed meeting of specialists was held in Nuremberg, where the results of these experiments were presented. Together with Roscher, Professor Holzlechner and Dr. Fink participated in the organization of the experiments. Despite the obvious cruelty and illegality of the described methods, none of the experts present expressed protest or condemnation. The experiments continued until the end of the spring of 1943, when Holzlechner and Finke terminated their participation, considering further research impractical. On Himmler's instructions, Roscher researched methods of warming people who had suffered frostbite. Among other things, the so-called animal heat method was studied with the involvement of female prisoners. Although the researcher initially doubted the effectiveness of this approach, the results were positive. During the experiments, cases of intimacy between subjects were recorded during the warming process, the effectiveness of which was compared with the effect of hot baths. A particularly revealing example of the inhumane treatment of prisoners was the use of human skin to manufacture various items, including saddles and clothing items. At the same time, there was a strict ban on using the skin of ethnic Germans. The bodies of the dead were boiled to produce skeletons used as teaching aids. Special rooms and installations were equipped for such procedures. Among other researchers, Dr. Brachtel stood out, conducting experiments on internal organs. Many prisoners died as a result of liver puncture without anesthesia. Various extreme situations were also simulated in the camp. For example, to study the effect of seawater on the body, groups of about 10 people were placed in isolated chambers where they received only salt water for 5 days. There are testimonies of survivors about the liberation of the camp, including Gleb Rahr, who arrived from Buchenwald. According to his memoirs, prisoners were held in the camp for some time because of the ongoing fighting and the threat from the retreating Nazis, who sought to eliminate witnesses to their atrocities. At the time of the arrival of the American troops, more than 30,000 prisoners were held in the camp. Subsequently, all of them were repatriated and received significant compensation, although no material compensation could compensate for their suffering.